You know the feeling. A room where you don't sound like yourself. Smaller voice, wrong words, a version of you that apologizes too much. And a different room, maybe just down the hall, where you're sharper, funnier, more solid. Same person. Two different realities. Nobody had to explain the mechanism to you for you to feel the difference. You've already shifted. You just never called it that. Millions of people online practice something called reality shifting. Scripting a desired life, rehearsing it in vivid detail, waiting for the door to open into another version of existence. Most of them think they're doing something mystical. They're not. They're doing something real, documented, and stranger than the mysticism. In the next few minutes, you're going to find out the one mechanism that actually explains why this practice works, and why it has nothing to do with parallel universes, and everything to do with which version of you your brain treats as default. I want to tell you about the first time I watched a shifting video and how hard I laughed. This was a few years ago, before the practice had a name most people recognized. Someone was describing with complete sincerity a method for using a specific pillow arrangement and a scripted script. Literally a written document describing their desired reality in the second person, present tense, to fall asleep and wake up in a different universe, one where they'd already achieved whatever they wanted. I remember thinking it was the most elaborate act of self-delusion I'd seen packaged as self-help in a long time. I screenshotted it to send to a friend, captioned, "People actually believe this." I want to be honest about how condescending I was about it, because that condescension is relevant to what happened next. I wasn't curious. I was collecting evidence for a conclusion I'd already reached, the way people do when something looks obviously silly on the surface, and they don't feel any need to look past the surface. I watched 2 more videos that week, not to understand the practice, but to find better material to mock. The specific vocabulary, the confident claims about vibrational alignment, the total absence of anything resembling a citation. What I didn't expect was to still be thinking about it a week later, not because I'd come around to the multiverse claim, I hadn't and I still haven't, but because something about the described experience kept nagging at me. People weren't just reporting that they felt better after scripting. They were reporting specific, measurable behavior changes, better posture, different word choices in real conversations, decisions made with a confidence they said they didn't have before. Whatever was happening, it wasn't purely imaginary in its effects, even if the explanation people were giving for it was almost certainly wrong. It's worth naming exactly how uncomfortable that gap was for me to sit in, because dismissing something entirely is so much easier than holding the explanation is wrong, but the effect might be real in your head at the same time. Most people never make it past the dismissal stage, and I nearly didn't either. What kept me there was simple stubbornness. I wanted to be able to say specifically and correctly why it didn't work, and I couldn't find that answer anywhere close to as easily as I expected to. So here's a question worth sitting with before you decide what side you're on. Have you ever noticed yourself becoming, even briefly, more like a person you'd imagined being? Not because anything external changed, but because you'd rehearsed it enough that it started leaking into how you actually showed up. If the answer is yes, you already have a data point that something real is happening here, whatever you want to call it. Take a second and actually search your own memory for that data point instead of skimming past the question. Maybe it was a specific speech or performance you ran through in your head so many times beforehand that your body knew what to do before your nerves caught up. Maybe it was a difficult conversation you rehearsed so thoroughly, alone in your car, that when the real moment came, you heard yourself say almost exactly the words you'd practiced, in almost exactly the tone. That wasn't luck. That was a possible self, rehearsed enough times to become available under pressure. The same mechanism this entire video is about to name properly. I started digging, mostly to prove myself right, expecting to find nothing under the mysticism except placebo and confirmation bias. What I found instead was a body of research that had nothing to do with reality shifting as a community or a trend, decades older than the TikTok videos sitting quietly in neuroscience and psychology journals. That explained, more precisely and more usefully than any scripting guide ever could, why rehearsing a version of yourself in vivid, repeated detail produces real behavioral change. The specific moment it clicked for me was reading about a completely unrelated study. Nothing to do with self-image, Nothing to do with manifestation, just a piece of motor learning research from the 1990s. And realizing the mechanism it described was structurally identical to what scripting practitioners were describing in their own language decades later, with none of the neuroscience vocabulary and all of the multiverse framing instead. Same mechanism, completely different explanation bolted on top of it. One borrowed from physics, the other borrowed from careful, boring, replicated lab work. This is the part that reframes the whole conversation, and it's worth being exact about it instead of romantic. The question was never, can you access a parallel universe through visualization? That question isn't just unanswerable, it's the wrong question, one that borrows the language of physics to dress up something considerably more mechanical and, honestly, more useful. The real question is, what does sustained, vivid mental rehearsal actually do to the brain generating your behavior? And if it does something real, why has it been marketed as interdimensional travel instead of what it actually is? I think I know part of the answer to that last question, even though this video isn't really about internet culture. You can literally shift to a parallel universe where you're already thin, already rich, already loved the way you want to be loved, is a considerably more exciting pitch than if you rehearse a specific version of yourself in vivid sensory detail for several weeks with real emotional engagement. You may gradually make that version more behaviorally accessible. Both sentences describe roughly the same underlying practice. Only one of them was ever going to trend. That's not a criticism of the people practicing it, and I want to be clear about that, because I've been unfairly dismissive of them once already in this video, and I don't want to repeat the mistake in a different direction. Most practitioners aren't naive. Many of them sense correctly that something real is happening when they script consistently. They just don't have access to the actual vocabulary for it, because nobody handed them the neuroscience, only the multiverse framing that happened to travel further online. If you're someone who's tried scripting before and quietly wondered whether you were fooling yourself, this video isn't here to tell you that you were. It's here to tell you that the part of the experience that felt real probably was, you were simply given the wrong operating manual for it. That explains why so many people report real change from a practice with an explanation that doesn't hold up. The change was never coming from the explanation. It doesn't yet explain the actual mechanism doing the work, or why your brain would be built in a way that makes vivid rehearsal this powerful in the first place. And that requires going back to a study involving a piano, 5 days and 2 groups of people, only one of which ever touched a key. Picture 2 groups of people in a lab, none of them professional musicians, all of them learning the same simple 5-finger piano exercise for the first time. Picture the setup in more detail, because it's worth actually seeing it rather than letting it pass as a summary. Researchers chose a deliberately simple sequence, a 5-note pattern any of the participants could learn the basic shape of within minutes, so the differences that emerged over the following days would reflect practice, not raw talent or prior musical background. None of the participants had significant piano experience. All of them started from roughly the same baseline, which matters, because it rules out the obvious objection that the mental practice group simply happened to include more naturally gifted people. The first group sits at an actual piano, 2 hours a day, 5 days straight, physically practicing the sequence, pressing the keys, hearing the notes, feeling the exercise get smoother under their fingers, the way anyone learning a new physical skill would expect to improve. The second group never touches a piano, not once across all 5 days. Instead, they sit in a chair, close their eyes, and imagine playing the exact same exercise, picturing their fingers moving to the correct keys, in the correct order, at the correct tempo for the same 2 hours a day purely in their minds. This was a real study, run by neuroscientist Alvaro Pascual-Leone and colleagues in 1995, and what they were actually measuring wasn't just performance, it was the physical brain itself, using transcranial magnetic stimulation to map how much of the motor cortex had become dedicated to controlling the finger movements involved in the exercise. In the physical practice group, the map expanded exactly as you'd expect. Repeated physical practice reorganized the motor cortex, allocating more neural territory to the movements being trained. That part wasn't surprising. Physical practice reshaping the brain is well established. It's worth pausing on the measurement method itself, because it's part of what makes this study so hard to wave away as a fluke. Transcranial magnetic stimulation lets researchers map, region by region, how much cortical territory is devoted to controlling a specific muscle group. Not a self-report, not a subjective impression, but a physical measurement of brain tissue responding to precisely targeted stimulation. This wasn't participants saying they felt more confident on the keys. This was researchers watching actual cortical maps expand, day over day, under controlled conditions. What was surprising is what happened in the group that never touched a piano. Their motor cortex maps expanded too. Not as much as the physical practice group, but significantly, following nearly the same trajectory for the first few days. Mental rehearsal alone with zero physical movement produced measurable physical reorganization in the exact brain region responsible for controlling the fingers being imagined. It gets stranger. After the 5 days of mental-only practice, that second group was brought to an actual piano for the first time and given a single 2-hour physical practice session. Their subsequent performance, accuracy and smoothness on the actual keys, matched what the physical practice group had achieved after 4 full days of real practice. One real session, preceded by 5 days of pure imagination, closed most of the gap, with 4 days of actual physical repetition. Sit with the actual numbers for a second, because they're the part that tends to get lost in a quick summary. 4 days of real physical practice versus 5 days of pure imagination plus 1 single physical session. The imagined practice group didn't simply feel more prepared going into that first physical session. Their measured skill level, tested against an objective performance standard, landed in roughly the same place as a group that had spent 4 times as many actual hours physically practicing at the keys. That's not a subjective, self-reported improvement. That's a controlled, replicated finding about what mental rehearsal, done correctly, is capable of producing. It's worth being precise about what this study proves and what it doesn't, because it's exactly the kind of finding that gets inflated into something more magical than it actually is. It doesn't prove that imagining something is equivalent to doing it. The physical practice group still outperformed the mental-only group at every stage, and no amount of imagined practice ever fully substitutes for the real thing when precise physical execution is required. What it proves is narrower and in its own way more useful. Vivid, detailed mental rehearsal activates and reshapes the same neural circuitry involved in the actual physical action, closely enough that the brain treats structured imagination as a meaningful category of practice, not empty daydreaming. Now, and before this starts sounding like a story only about pianos, here's the bridge worth making explicit. If imagining a finger movement in enough sensory detail reorganizes the brain region that controls your fingers, what do you think happens when you imagine in equal detail a version of yourself speaking with more confidence, walking into a room differently, making a decision without hesitating? The mechanism doesn't stop being real just because the thing being rehearsed is a personality trait instead of a finger movement. This isn't a leap the original researchers made, and it's worth being honest about that boundary. Pascual-Leone's study was about finger movements, not personalities, and nothing in the original paper claims the finding extends to complex behavioral traits. What can be said honestly is this: the underlying principle that vivid mental rehearsal engages overlapping neural circuitry with actual physical practice has since been studied and replicated across a range of domains beyond motor skills, including some emerging work on behavioral and social rehearsal specifically. This video isn't asking you to take a piano study as literal proof about confidence and courage. It's asking you to notice that the mechanism connecting imagination to real neural change is well established, and that the extension to more complex, socially rehearsed behavior is a reasonable, actively studied hypothesis, not a wild leap invented for a video script. This is where a second, separate line of research becomes relevant, because Pascual-Leone's piano study explains how rehearsal reshapes motor circuitry. It doesn't, by itself, explain why rehearsing an entire version of yourself would work the same way. For that, you need to understand what psychologists actually mean by the structure of self-concept, and it's considerably less fixed than most people assume. In 1986, psychologists Hazel, Markus and Paula Nurius published research introducing what they called possible selves, the idea that your self-concept isn't a single fixed entity, but a working collection of different versions of yourself. The self you currently are, the self you hope to become, the self you're afraid of becoming, and various other selves you've imagined with different degrees of vividness and detail. Their research found that these possible selves aren't purely abstract fantasies sitting off to the side of your real identity. They function as active components of how you interpret situations, set goals, and regulate your own behavior in the moment, closer to genuinely available operating modes than daydreams you occasionally visit. It's worth understanding why Markus and Nurius thought this mattered enough to formalize into a theory, rather than leaving it as an obvious-sounding observation. Before their work, most psychological models of self-concept treated identity as something closer to a fixed trait profile. You're introverted or extroverted, conscientious or not, and that profile predicts your behavior. What Markus and Nurius proposed instead was considerably more dynamic, that a person carries an entire population of possible selves simultaneously, and which one is currently active shapes behavior far more than any single fixed trait score ever could. Two people with identical personality profiles on paper could behave completely differently in the same situation, depending entirely on which possible self each of them had rehearsed enough to have ready. Notice how close this already sounds to reality shifting, using entirely different, well-established vocabulary. A working population of selves, one of which becomes dominant not through metaphysics, but through practice. Markus and Nurius's research suggested something specific and testable. The more elaborated and vividly detailed a possible self is, the more concrete sensory and behavioral content it has, rather than remaining a vague wish, the more accessible it becomes as an actual guide for real behavior in real situations. A vaguely hoped-for, better version of me barely influences anything. Say, possible self-rehearsed in specific, sensory, repeated detail, how they stand, what they say, how they handle a specific kind of conflict, starts functioning less like a fantasy and more like a genuinely available behavioral template, one your brain can actually reach for under pressure. It's worth being clear about the boundary of this claim too, the same way this video has tried to be honest about the piano study's limits. Markus and Nurius weren't claiming that simply picturing a confident version of yourself instantly makes you confident. Their research, and the substantial body of work that followed it, points to something more modest and more earned. Rehearsal increases accessibility, not certainty of outcome. A well-rehearsed possible self becomes more likely to get reached for in the moment. It doesn't guarantee the moment goes well. That distinction matters, because overselling it into a guarantee is exactly the kind of claim that makes people give up after one disappointing attempt, having expected magic instead of increased odds. So, hold these two findings together for a second, because this is where the real mechanism behind reality shifting starts to come into focus. Pascual-Leone's piano study shows that vivid mental rehearsal physically reorganizes the brain circuits involved in the rehearsed action. Markus and Nurius's research shows that a specific, vividly rehearsed version of yourself becomes a more accessible, more usable behavioral template than a vague, unrehearsed one. Put those together, and scripting a desired reality stops sounding like mysticism and starts sounding like exactly what a neuroscientist would predict should work, for reasons that have nothing to do with alternate universes. That validates the paradox from block 1. But it opens something harder to sit with, because if a rehearsed version of yourself genuinely becomes more accessible, the more you practice it, what happens to the version of you that isn't being rehearsed? What happens to the possible self quietly sitting unpracticed, while a different one gets reinforced by default every single day, without you ever consciously choosing which one? There's an uncomfortable symmetry worth naming before moving forward. If this mechanism is real, it doesn't only explain how a hoped-for version of yourself could become more accessible through deliberate rehearsal. It also explains how a feared, unwanted version of yourself becomes more accessible through the exact same mechanism, applied accidentally by default every time you rehearse it without meaning to, every anxious rumination, every worst-case scenario played out in vivid detail, every self-critical script run silently while you fall asleep. The piano study didn't only show that intentional practice reshapes the brain, it showed that repeated, vivid rehearsal reshapes the brain, full stop, regardless of whether the rehearsal was chosen on purpose or simply defaulted into out of habit. Here's where this stops being about pianos and lab studies and starts being about your actual week. Think about how differently you behave in different rooms of your own life. Not as a metaphor, but literally. The version of you that shows up at your parents' house using old speech patterns and old postures you thought you'd outgrown. The version of you at work, careful, measured, running a completely different internal script than the one running at a friend's birthday dinner 3 hours later. You've never needed a scripting ritual to access these different versions. You already have several fully operational possible selves on rotation, switching between them so automatically you rarely notice the switch happening at all. Notice, too, how physically different these versions can feel, not just verbally. Your shoulders sit differently in one room than another. Your voice finds a different register without you deciding to change it. If someone recorded you in both settings and showed you the footage side by side, you might genuinely be startled by how much changed. Posture, pacing, even the rhythm of your breathing, all without a single conscious decision to become someone else in the doorway. That's not performance. That's a possible self, already fully rehearsed through years of repetition, activating automatically the moment the context calls for it. Here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with directly. Which of those versions have you been unconsciously rehearsing the most, just through sheer repetition, regardless of whether you actually want it reinforced? The anxious version that over-apologizes at work doesn't need a scripting ritual to strengthen its neural pathway. It gets rehearsed for free. Every single day you show up and run that same script without noticing you're doing it. The exact mechanism from Pascual-Leone's study, just running on autopilot, on a version of you nobody consciously chose. Sit with that phrase for a second. Nobody consciously chose it. That's true of almost every default script running your life right now, the helpful ones and the unhelpful ones alike. None of them were selected in a deliberate meeting where you weighed the options. They simply accumulated repetitions, quietly, over years, until repetition alone made them feel like identity. This is the actual mechanism hiding underneath a huge amount of stuck. This is just who I am self-concept. It was never really about some fixed, essential truth about your personality. It's closer to a matter of repetition, which possible self gets rehearsed in vivid detail, often enough that it becomes the default template your brain reaches for under pressure, and which one sits neglected, vague, and consequently unavailable exactly when you need it. Ask yourself honestly, how many years you've spent describing a trait as fixed. I've just always been anxious in groups. I've never been good at confrontation, without once asking how much of that fixedness was actual, immovable fact, and how much was simply an extremely well-rehearsed default, reinforced daily by nothing more mysterious than repetition, nobody ever redirected. Watch how this compounds the same way physical practice compounds. The over-apologizing version of you at work isn't rehearsed once and then fixed forever. It gets re-rehearsed every single time you catch yourself doing it, and don't interrupt the pattern. Every unchallenged instance functioning as one more repetition, reinforcing the exact circuitry Pascual-Leone's piano players were reinforcing, just applied to a behavioral pattern instead of a finger movement. Meanwhile, the calmer, more solid version of you, the one that shows up, say, with your closest friend, or in the one context where you actually feel like yourself, stays exactly as underdeveloped as an unpracticed piece of music, available in principle, undertrained in practice. There's a specific trap worth naming here because it catches a lot of well-intentioned people. Noticing the unwanted pattern isn't the same as interrupting it, and a lot of self-awareness stops right at noticing, satisfied with having identified the pattern without ever doing the second, harder step of rehearsing something different in its place. I always do this said with resigned recognition isn't neutral. Said often enough in that same resigned tone, it's still a rehearsal, just a rehearsal of the resignation itself, strengthening the exact self-concept it claims to be lamenting. Here's a fact worth sitting with directly. In follow-up research building on the possible selves framework, psychologists have found that people who regularly and specifically rehearse a hoped-for self, not vaguely wishing, but picturing concrete scenarios in detail, show measurably better follow-through on related goals than people who only rehearse in vague, general terms. The specificity isn't decoration, it's the entire mechanism. Ask yourself honestly, when you picture the version of yourself you want to be, Is it a specific scene, with specific words and a specific posture? Or is it a vague, warm feeling, with no actual content your brain can rehearse? Most people, asked that question honestly, realize their version of wanting to change has been almost entirely feeling and almost no content. A general sense of dissatisfaction with the current script, paired with no actual alternative scene ever rehearsed in its place. That's not a failure of willpower. It's a category error, the same one that would doom a piano student who spent 5 days simply wishing they were better at piano instead of imagining, specifically, their fingers on specific keys. Wishing was never going to move the cortical map. Only specific rehearsal was. Here's the part that reframes what most people mean by just being who I am. You cannot simply decide once to become a different version of yourself and have it stick. That was never how any of this works, in the lab or anywhere else. What you can do is notice which version is currently getting the free automatic repetitions, the unconscious rehearsal happening by default, and start deliberately diverting some of that rehearsal toward the version you'd actually choose with the same specificity Markus and Nurius's research found necessary. Not a vague wish, but a scene in detail, repeated. Consider how this shows up in something as small as how you answer the phone. The clipped, slightly defensive tone you use with a specific family member, rehearsed for years without ever being chosen, versus the warmer tone you use with someone else. Both are equally real possible selves, equally you, differing mainly in how much unconscious repetition each one has received. Neither is more authentically yours than the other. One has simply had more practice. There's a version of this worth naming that runs specifically through vulnerability, because it's one of the clearest places this mechanism shows its work. Think about a version of yourself you've genuinely wanted to be for years. Someone who asks for help without shame, or says no without over-explaining, or shares an opinion in a meeting without pre-apologizing for having one. If you've never once let yourself picture that version in specific sensory detail, not, "I wish I were more confident," as a vague wish, but an actual imagined scene, with actual words, an actual room, an actual tone of voice, then under everything this video has covered, that version was never going to become accessible through wanting alone. Wanting isn't rehearsal. It doesn't move the cortical map. Only specific, repeated, detailed rehearsal does that, the same way 5 days of imagined piano did it, and 0 days of wishing for piano skill ever would. So if you're already running multiple possible selves, switching between them constantly, reinforcing whichever one gets the most repetition by pure accident of habit, what would it actually take to choose, on purpose, which one gets reinforced next? What's the actual mechanical difference between rehearsal that works and rehearsal that's just wishful daydreaming with nothing behind it? That difference is exactly where the next layer of this video picks up, and it comes from a completely different corner of psychology, one that has nothing to do with pianos or self-concept on the surface, and everything to do with why some rehearsal sticks and some doesn't. This is the layer that explains why reality shifting as a practice has real structure to it, and why it isn't simply positive thinking wearing a new outfit. And it starts with a completely different line of research that at first glance has nothing to do with self-concept at all. In 1975, psychologists Duncan, Godden and Baddeley ran a study with deep-sea divers, testing something called state-dependent memory. Divers memorized a list of words either on dry land or underwater, then were tested on recall either in the same environment they'd learned in or the opposite one. The finding was strikingly consistent. Recall was significantly better when the environment at testing matched the environment at learning. Words learned underwater were better recalled underwater, and words learned on land were better recalled on land, regardless of which environment felt more comfortable overall. It's worth sitting with how counterintuitive that last detail is. You might expect that dry land, being the more comfortable ordinary environment, would simply produce better recall across the board. It didn't. Comfort wasn't the variable that mattered. Matching was. Divers who'd learned underwater actually recalled worse on land than they did back underwater, even though land is, by any ordinary measure, the easier environment to think clearly in. The brain wasn't asking which setting is more pleasant. It was asking which setting matches the one this information was originally filed under. Notice, before moving forward, how this already explains something you may have experienced without a name for it, trying to feel brave in a calm, safe moment, only to have that rehearsed bravery completely vanish the instant you're actually standing in the doorway of the hard conversation, heart pounding, in a completely different internal state than the one you rehearsed in. That's not you failing at the practice. That's exactly what Godden and Baddeley's divers experienced, translated from water and land into calm and adrenaline. The core discovery generalizes well beyond diving and beyond physical environment specifically. Memory, and more broadly behavior, is heavily influenced by matching internal and external states between encoding and retrieval. Later research extended this to emotional and physiological states, not just physical location. Information and behavioral patterns learned in one internal state, one mood, one level of arousal, tend to be more accessible when you're back in a similar state and less accessible when you're not. Think about how this plays out in your own life outside any lab. Something you rehearsed while calm and clear-headed, the exact words you plan to say in a hard conversation, often evaporates the moment you're actually flooded with anxiety in the real conversation. Not because you forgot it, but because the calm state version of you filed it under conditions your anxious state self can't easily access. This is a genuinely common and frustrating experience, and state-dependent memory research offers a mechanical explanation for it that has nothing to do with willpower or forgetfulness. The information isn't gone. It's filed under a state you're not currently in. Here's why that matters enormously for what reality shifting is actually doing. Scripting isn't just imagining a scene. Practitioners consistently describe engaging the practice with real emotional intensity, genuinely trying to feel the confidence, the calm, the specific physiological state of the person they're rehearsing, not just picturing it from a cold, detached distance. Under the state-dependent framework, that emotional engagement isn't decoration or performance. It's doing real mechanical work, pairing a specific behavioral template, the possible self being rehearsed, with a specific internal state, so that reaching that state again in ordinary life makes the associated behavior more accessible, more available, closer to automatic. This offers something scripting practitioners could actually use tonight if they understood the mechanism behind it. Don't just picture the scene from a distance. Get as close as you honestly can to the actual feeling state you're rehearsing for, not performed excitement, but something closer to the real physiological texture of the confidence, the calm, the specific emotional register you're trying to make more accessible. The scene is the content. The feeling is what files it under conditions your real life will actually be able to retrieve it from. This also explains something that scripting communities have noticed empirically without having a mechanism for it. People consistently report that cold, purely intellectual visualization, picturing a scene without actually trying to feel anything, produces far weaker results than scripting done with genuine emotional investment. Under Godden and Baddeley's framework, that difference makes complete sense. A scene rehearsed without the matching internal state is like memorizing a word list on land and expecting perfect recall underwater. The content might be there. The state that makes it retrievable in the moments that matter isn't. So hold three findings together now, because this is where the actual mechanism completes itself. Pascual-Leone's research shows vivid mental rehearsal physically reorganizes the neural circuitry involved in the rehearsed action. Markus and Nurius's research shows a specifically, vividly rehearsed possible self becomes a more available behavioral template than a vague one. And Godden and Baddeley's research shows that pairing a behavior with a specific internal state makes that behavior more retrievable when the state recurs. Combine all three and scripting a desired reality, sitting down, engaging real emotion, rehearsing a specific version of yourself in vivid sensory and emotional detail, repeatedly, isn't mystical at all. It's a near-perfect, if accidentally assembled, application of three separate, well-documented mechanisms for changing which behavioral pattern your brain treats as default. It's worth pointing out how unlikely this convergence actually is, in a way that should increase your confidence rather than decrease it. None of these three research programs were designed with each other in mind. Pascual-Leone was studying motor learning in the 1990s. Markus and Nurius were studying self-concept and motivation in the 1980s. Godden and Baddeley were studying memory and context in the 1970s, with actual scuba divers, for reasons that had nothing to do with self-improvement at all. 3 separate labs, 3 separate decades, 3 separate research questions, none of them talking to each other, all arriving at compatible pieces of the same underlying mechanism, which is a considerably stronger form of evidence than a single study built specifically to prove a point, because nobody was reaching for this conclusion on purpose. This is worth stating plainly, because it's the part every skeptical version of this video needs to hear clearly. This doesn't mean the practice is easy, or instant, or guaranteed. Pascual-Leone's piano players needed 5 full days of repeated, structured, effortful mental rehearsal to produce a measurable effect. Not 5 minutes, not a single hopeful visualization before bed. The mechanism is real. It is also, like any form of practice, genuinely demanding of consistency, detail, and repetition, which is precisely why most people who try scripting once or twice and quit never see the effect the research actually predicts. This also explains a pattern worth naming honestly, the online scripting community's own internal folk wisdom, that shifting rarely works on the first try, that it takes weeks of consistent practice, that people who give up after a few nights almost never report success, lines up exactly with what you'd predict from the underlying mechanism, even though the community itself doesn't usually explain it this way. 5 days of imagined piano moved the needle. 1 night of imagined confidence almost certainly won't. The folk wisdom got the timeline roughly right, for reasons the community couldn't fully articulate, because they were describing a real mechanism through an explanation that happened to be wrong. Here's the mechanism, stated as plainly as this video can manage after everything it's covered. Choosing your reality, stripped of the multiverse language, means choosing specifically, vividly, and with real emotional engagement, repeated enough times to matter. Which possible self gets the rehearsal that makes it more physically, neurally, and behaviorally accessible than the others currently running on autopilot? That's not smaller than the mystical version. It's more demanding, because it requires actual structured repetition rather than a single hopeful evening. And it's more honest, because it explains exactly why the practice produces the specific, measurable changes people keep reporting, without requiring a single unproven claim about parallel universes. There's a specific kind of relief available in that honesty, if you let yourself feel it instead of treating it as a downgrade from the mystical version. A parallel universe was never something you could control the existence of. A rehearsal schedule is entirely within your control, starting tonight, requiring nothing except the same unglamorous repetition that moved a cortical map in a lab in 1995, decades before anyone thought to call it shifting. I want to stop explaining the research for a second and just talk to you. Take a breath before the next part, because it asks you to be honest with yourself in a way the research so far hasn't required. Because I think you already know which version of yourself has been getting the free repetitions, the one that shows up when you're tired, when you're around a specific person, when an old situation triggers an old script you never consciously chose and have simply kept running, unrehearsed on purpose but rehearsed anyway, every single time you don't interrupt it. I don't know which specific version that is for you, and I'm not going to guess, but I know it has a shape because it always does, a particular tone of voice, a particular thing you say right before you shrink, a particular room in your life where you consistently become smaller than you actually are. You've probably called it just how I am around them for so long that questioning it feels almost disloyal to your own self-understanding. And I think you also know, at least roughly, which version you'd actually choose if choosing were as simple as wanting it. The steadier version, the one who doesn't over-apologize, the one who speaks first instead of waiting for permission that never comes. That version isn't hiding from you, it's not blocked by anything mystical, and it was never on the other side of a door in some other universe. It's under-rehearsed. That's the entire distance between you and it, repetitions not yet spent. You're not being asked to become a different person out of nothing. You're being asked to notice which possible self has been winning by default, purely on repetition, and to start giving a few of those repetitions deliberately to the version you'd actually pick. That's not smaller than shifting universes, it's just realer, which means it's going to ask more of you than a bedtime script ever could. It's also going to ask something specific of you that most self-improvement content skips over: patience with the gap between rehearsing and becoming. There will be a stretch, probably a long one, where you're deliberately rehearsing a version of yourself that still doesn't feel automatic yet, where the old script still fires first, out of habit, and the new one has to be consciously chosen instead of naturally arriving. That gap isn't failure. It's exactly what 4 days of physical piano practice looked like next to 5 days of pure imagination. Behind, for a while, by design, before it isn't. Back to where we started. The 2 rooms, the 2 versions of you, the shift you'd already made 100 times before this video ever gave it a name. Here's the 1-sentence version of everything this video has tried to say. Reality shifting was never a door to another universe. It's the real, demanding, well-documented process of deciding which version of yourself gets rehearsed enough to become default. Say that back to yourself once slowly before the video ends, not as a slogan but as the actual working definition you're taking with you. And here's the layer I didn't tell you at the start, because it's not a metaphor, it's a process. Sounds on the surface like it should be reassuring, and it isn't, not entirely. A process means work. It means the version of you sitting unrehearsed right now doesn't arrive because you wanted it badly enough for one night. It arrives the way the piano player's skill arrived, through unglamorous, repeated, specific rehearsal, most of it invisible, most of it not feeling like progress in the moment. I think that's actually the more honest gift underneath all of this, more honest than a door to another universe ever could be. A door either exists or it doesn't, and you'd have no control over which. A process, on the other hand, responds to exactly the kind of effort you're capable of giving it. Not perfect, not constant, just repeated, specific, and real. That's a considerably better deal than waiting for a portal that was never going to open, even though it asks more of you up front. That's what choose your reality actually means once you strip the multiverse framing off it. Not a portal, a practice. The version of you that's been quietly available this whole time, one room over, was never blocked by a dimensional barrier. It was only ever blocked by repetition going somewhere else. You were never choosing between universes. You were always choosing between rehearsals. Tonight, if you script anything at all, script something specific. Not a mood, not a vibe, but an actual scene, an actual sentence you'd say, an actual way you'd stand in an actual room. That specificity was never a minor detail in this video. It's the entire mechanism. Restated one last time in the plainest form this video can manage. Vague wanting doesn't move the map. Specific, repeated rehearsal does. If this video gave you language for something you'd already sensed, but never had the mechanism for, that's exactly what this channel exists to do every week. Subscribing isn't a favor to me. It's a private agreement with the version of you that's ready to start choosing what gets rehearsed. That's who this channel is built for. Whatever version of yourself you've been quietly wishing for without ever rehearsing it in detail, tonight is as good a night as any to give it its first real repetition. Comment: I choose the rehearsal. Tomorrow we close the week with something quieter. The case for letting go of force altogether, and why the universe tends to answer better when you stop pushing. I'll see you there.